The auctioneer's voice cut through the September air like a blade. 5,000, do I hear 55, 55 anywhere? Walter Greer stood at the back of the crowd with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his canvas jacket, the one with the torn left elbow he'd been meaning to fix for 6 years. He wasn't bidding. He wasn't there to buy anything. He was there to watch his neighbor lose everything, and he was there because he couldn't stay home, because staying home would have felt like looking away. The farm going up for auction that morning, 280 acres of exhausted Ozark bottomland outside Caulfield, Missouri in Howell County, had once grown some of the finest field corn in the state. Now its topsoil was gray and cracked. The house needed a new roof. The John Deere 4440 sitting in the driveway had a cracked manifold and a bid of $3,200. Walter watched the gavel fall. He turned and walked back to his truck. He had 800 acres of his own, and he had an idea that everyone, his banker, his neighbors, his own brother, had told him was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard. He was going to plant an orchard. Let me tell you about Howell County, Missouri, in the spring of 1985. It sits in the southern reach of the Missouri Ozarks, where the land doesn't lay flat and polite like it does in Iowa or Illinois. It rises and folds and tilts at you. The creeks run fast after rain and run dry in August. The soil is thin in places, a foot of good earth before you hit chert and limestone, and in other spots down in the hollows, it's black and deep and rich as anywhere on the continent. The county seat is West Plains, population around 8,000 in those days. One hospital, a couple of grain elevators, a Piggly Wiggly, and enough Baptist churches to keep a man busy every Sunday until he died. The agricultural economy of Howell County in 1985 was in genuine crisis. The farm debt explosion of the early 1980s had followed the grain price collapse that followed the Soviet grain embargo. Farmers who had borrowed heavily in the inflationary 70s, when land values were soaring and lenders were practically throwing money through car windows, now found themselves trapped. Land that had been worth $2,000 an acre in 1979 was worth $800 in 1985. The interest rates that the Federal Reserve had driven to 20% to kill inflation hadn't fully come down, and in Howell County, where farms weren't as large or as mechanized as the Corn Belt giants, the margin for error was always thinner. The air that spring smelled of diesel and turned earth and something older underneath, the particular mineral coolness of the Ozarks, a smell that has no name but that anyone who grew up there will recognize instantly, the way you recognize your grandmother's kitchen. Bluebirds were back on the fence posts. Redbuds were blooming along the creek bottoms in explosions of pink that seemed almost reckless given the times. And somewhere on a south-facing hillside on the Greer farm, a 53-year-old man with dirt under his fingernails and a surveyor's flag in his hand was walking the contour of a slope that everyone else thought was worthless. Walter Greer was not a man who made speeches. He was 5'10", lean in the way that comes from physical work over decades rather than from any kind of deliberate effort, with hands so large and calloused they looked like they belonged to a man a foot taller. He had gray at his temples by 1985. It had come in early in his 40s, which his wife Pauline said was on account of worrying, and which Walter said was on account of genetics, and neither of them was entirely wrong. He had grown up on this land. His father, Earl Greer, had bought the original 320 acres in 1948 with money saved during the war, when Earl had worked as a welder in a Springfield munitions plant and lived on almost nothing. Earl had paid $38 an acre, which at the time felt like a fortune and turned out to be a bargain. He had grown row crops, corn, soybeans, some wheat, and kept a small cow-calf operation in the creek pastures. Walter had taken over in 1974, when Earl's heart gave out during a July hay cutting. He was 42. He had a son, Dale, who was 16 and wanted nothing to do with farming. He had a daughter, Renee, who was 12 and would later become a veterinarian in Joplin. He had a $114,000 operating note at First Ozark Bank and a 1971 Ford 9000 tractor that burned oil and smoked like a foundry. He also had, in a box under his workbench in the equipment shed, a 3-inch thick stack of photocopied articles, USDA extension bulletins, and correspondence with a professor at the University of Missouri's Fruit Research Station in Mountain Grove, which, remarkably, was only 22 miles up Highway 95 from his farm. That professor's name was Dr. James Aldrich, and for 4 years, beginning in 1981, he and Walter had been exchanging letters about one subject: the commercial viability of late-season apple varieties in the Missouri Ozarks. Walter had not told his banker about the letters. He had not told his brother Carl, who farmed 400 acres over in Oregon County. He had barely told Pauline, though she knew something was building in him the way a wife always knows. The way she'd find him at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with a yellow legal pad covered in numbers, and he'd close it before she could see. Walter Greer was not a gambler. He was not impulsive. He was the kind of man who replaced a fence post the moment it showed rot rather than waiting until the cow got through. He thought in decades rather than seasons. What he was about to do had been building in him for 4 years. And it was about to make him the laughingstock of Howell County. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room or at a sale barn or standing by a fence when someone with more money than sense explained to you exactly why your idea was foolish? Not quietly, not privately, but loud enough for everyone around to hear. That's what Roger Holt did to Walter Greer in the parking lot of the Howell County Farm Bureau office on a Tuesday morning in April of 1985. Roger Holt was, by any measurable standard of 1985 rural Missouri, a successful man. He farmed 1,400 acres across 2 counties, ran a seed dealership out of a metal building on the south edge of West Plains, and had just taken delivery on a brand new John Deere 8450 four-wheel drive tractor, a machine that cost $87,000 and that Roger drove past slower traffic, the way a man drives a new truck past people who knew him when he was broke. Roger was 51, broad through the chest, with a prosperous man's belly and the kind of handshake that's meant to establish something rather than communicate warmth. He wore a gimme cap from Pioneer Seed even when he wasn't at work. He served on the board of First Ozark Bank, which is worth remembering. He had a habit, and this was a genuine character flaw rather than a performance, which somehow made it worse, of finishing other people's sentences. Not because he was quick, but because he'd already decided he knew what you were going to say and found it tedious to wait. Walter had made the mistake of mentioning his plans to one person, his neighbor Gene Stovall, who was a good man but who talked, and Gene had mentioned it to his wife, and his wife had mentioned it at the Farm Bureau Women's Auxiliary, and by Tuesday morning Roger Holt had the whole story, slightly wrong in every detail and exactly right in its essential absurdity as he understood it. "Walt," Roger said loud enough for the 4 other men standing nearby to hear, "a performance, no question about it. I'm hearing you're fixin' to plant fruit trees on that south hill where you used to run your heifers." Walter said that was about right. "What kind?" "Apples mostly, some pears, maybe 40 acres to start." Roger looked at the men beside him. He let the pause breathe. Then he smiled the smile of a man who knows he has an audience and intends to use it. "Walt," he said, "I like you, you know I do, so I'm going to tell you this as a friend." He stepped closer and his voice dropped just enough to become confidential without losing its carrying power. "Apple growing in Howell County is a hobby, it ain't a business. You know what the wholesale price of a bushel of Ozark apples runs. You know what a commercial packing house in Washington state can deliver apples for. You are going to spend 4 or 5 years without a dime of income off that ground, and when you finally do pick something, you're going to wholesale it for less than it cost you to grow it." He tilted his head. "Might as well light that hillside on fire and collect the ash." The men around him laughed, not mean-spiritedly. They thought Roger was funny and mostly right. Walter stood there with his hands in his pockets and said nothing. He had a quality when he didn't want to argue of becoming very still, not tense, just still. He got in his truck and drove home. That afternoon, he called a post hole digger and ordered 2,400 board feet of locust posts and $18,000 worth of young apple trees from a nursery in Elgin, Illinois. The spring of 1985 in Howell County was the kind that teases you, warm in March. A hard frost in April that killed the peach blossoms on the few old trees people kept in their yards. Warm again in May with rain that came in slow, soaking pulses rather than the violent storms that would come later in summer. Walter broke ground on the South Hill on April 28, 1985. He used his own 1976 International Harvester 1066 tractor, a machine with 125 horsepower that he'd bought used in 1979 for $31,000. And that, in the way of well-maintained equipment, had become more reliable over time rather than less. to pull a rented subsoiler down the contour lines of the hill, breaking the hardpan 12 inches down to improve drainage. Then he hired a soil scientist from the Mountain Grove Research Station for 2 days to take grid samples across the 42 acres he'd selected, analyze pH, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, organic matter. The results came back and confirmed what Walter had suspected. The hill's south-facing orientation, its limestone-laden subsoil that drained fast, and its slightly higher elevation, enough to reduce frost risk versus the bottomland, made it genuinely suited to apple production. Not suited the way Iowa is suited to corn, where the land practically grows it by itself. Suited the way a difficult person is suited to a difficult job. It would require exactly the right approach, and the rewards would be real. He planted 340 trees that first year. Not a monoculture, this was deliberate, and it reflected something Dr. Aldrich had been telling him for years. He planted primarily Jonagold, a variety developed at the New York Agricultural Experiment Station in 1943 that had been gaining commercial traction in the 1980s, larger than a Jonathan, with a complex sweet-tart flavor and excellent storage characteristics. He planted a block of Gold Rush, a newer disease-resistant variety that ripened late and kept well into winter. And he planted a smaller block of Arkansas Black, an old Ozark heirloom variety that had been grown in this part of Missouri since the 1870s, and that commanded a premium at the small roadside markets that served the Branson Tourism Corridor, 90 miles to the west. He did not plant Red Delicious. This matters. In 1985, Red Delicious was still the dominant commercial apple in American production, a variety that had been so ruthlessly bred for appearance over the preceding 40 years that it had essentially lost its flavor. It looked magnificent. It tasted like sweetened cardboard. Walter had tasted enough of them to know this, and he had read enough of the agricultural press to understand that the market for undifferentiated commodity apples was precisely where Roger Holt had said it was: brutal and nearly impossible for a small Missouri grower to compete in. He was not growing commodity apples. He wasn't sure yet what he was growing, but it wasn't that. The confrontation, the real, public one, came in June of 1985 at the Howell County Farm Bureau annual meeting, held in the gymnasium of South Howell High School in Willow Springs. Folding tables, terrible coffee, ceiling fans turning slow against the heat. Roger Holt, who had been on the Farm Bureau board for 6 years, had the floor during an open discussion of alternative agricultural strategies, which was the polite term in those days for the desperate searching that happened when corn and soybean prices crushed everyone's margins. "I'll tell you what alternative means," Roger said, not looking at Walter but angling his body toward the table where Walter sat. "It means doing something so complicated and risky that you've talked yourself into believing the big operators can't figure it out. It means convincing yourself that you found something everyone else missed." He paused. "I had a conversation with a grower from Greer County who tried to build a commercial orchard in 1978. Know what happened? He ate 7 years of operating costs, got one good crop at about a third of what he needed, and sold the land in 1985 to pay his debts." He finally looked at Walter. "Not naming names," he said, "but if someone in this room is thinking about doing the same thing, I'd think hard." The room was quiet. People were looking at Walter. Walter was looking at the table. "Roger," Walter said finally, without raising his voice, "how long does a John Deere 8450 last before it's worth nothing?" Roger blinked. What does that have to do with anything?" "Just asking. 15 years, 20. "I don't see what." "An apple tree," Walter said, "lives 100 years. He didn't say anything else. It wasn't a rebuttal that won over the room. People smiled awkwardly. Roger moved on to the next agenda item, but something had shifted slightly and quietly, the way a foundation shifts before anyone notices. "Let me pause here and ask you something. What is the difference between a gamble and a calculated risk?" Because that word, gamble, was what people used about Walter's orchard all through the late 1980s. And I want you to understand how wrong it was and why it was wrong, because it matters to the story. Walter Greer had not, in fact, stumbled onto an idea. He had built a case file. Beginning in 1981, he had been corresponding regularly with Dr. James Aldrich of the Missouri State Fruit Experiment Station in Mountain Grove. The station had been doing applied research on fruit varieties suited to the Ozarks since 1899, one of the longest-running agricultural research programs in the state. Dr. Aldrich, who was 60 years old in 1985 and had spent 30 years studying Ozark fruit production, was a precise, methodical man who published in journals that almost no farmers read, and who possessed one of the most detailed maps of microclimate variations in the Missouri Ozarks that existed anywhere. Walter had first contacted him after reading a single paragraph in a 1980 University of Missouri Extension bulletin about the commercial potential of disease-resistant apple varieties in the eastern Ozarks. He had driven to Mountain Grove that October with a soil sample, a hand-drawn topographic sketch of his South Hill, and a list of 23 written questions. Aldrich, who was accustomed to farmers coming in wanting to be told what to do, and who were then disappointed by the complexity of the answer, had been surprised by Walter's questions. They were specific. They showed that he had done preliminary reading. Question 7, for example, asked about the correlation between calcium availability and fire blight resistance in Jonagold on dwarfing rootstock at elevations between 900 and 1,200 feet. Aldrich had later told a graduate student that it was one of the best questions he'd ever been asked by a layman. Over the next 4 years, they had exchanged 41 letters. Walter had driven to Mountain Grove 6 times. He had walked orchards. He had tasted hundreds of apples, many of them varieties that had never been sold in any grocery store, varieties with names like Spigold and Crispin and Honeygold that had been developed in experiment stations, and had never found commercial backing because the grocery chains had decided in the 1960s that American consumers wanted 2 things: red delicious and golden delicious, and everything else was a distraction. Dr. Aldrich believed, and had been writing and saying for years, that this was about to change. His argument, and this is where the real knowledge was, rested on 3 observations. First, the rise of farmers' markets and direct marketing channels in the early 1980s had created, for the first time in decades, a pathway for small growers to capture retail rather than wholesale prices. A bushel of apples that wholesaled to a packing house for $4.50 could retail at a farm stand for $14. The math was transformative if you controlled the channel. Second, American eating habits were changing. The generation entering its peak earning and food purchasing years in the late 1980s and 1990s was more educated about food quality than its parents. The organic movement, the farmers' market movement, the growing interest in heirloom varieties, these were not fringe phenomena. They were the leading edge of a structural shift in how Americans related to food. Dr. Aldrich had been watching this develop in academic literature and in the behavior of grocery retailers in major cities since the late 1970s. Third, and most specifically to Walter's situation, the Branson Tourism Corridor in Stone and Taney counties, 90 miles west of Walter's farm, was entering a period of explosive growth. Branson had been a small resort town built around Silver Dollar City and the White River since the 1960s, but in the mid-1980s it was beginning to attract major country music performers. By the early 1990s, it would become one of the most visited tourist destinations in America, with more theater seats than Broadway. Dr. Aldrich had pointed to this in a 1983 letter. The tourist market you are positioned to serve, if you can develop a direct sale operation, may represent more reliable demand than any commodity channel. Walter had read that sentence so many times the paper had softened at the fold. He also had one more piece of knowledge that nobody in Howell County knew he possessed. In September of 1984, he had driven alone to Adams County, Pennsylvania, 3 days each way in his '78 Chevy pickup, to spend a week visiting commercial apple orchards in the Gettysburg area. Adams County was one of the most productive apple-growing regions in the eastern United States. He had called ahead and arranged to spend a day each at 4 different operations, ranging from a 60-acre family farm to a 400-acre commercial operation with a cold storage facility and a retail barn that drew customers from Philadelphia. He had come back with 2 notebooks filled with observations, a head full of ideas, and the deep, unshakable conviction that what those Pennsylvania growers were doing, what made the difference between the ones who were thriving and the ones who were struggling, had almost nothing to do with their trees. It had to do with the experience they sold. The thriving orchards had cider mills running on weekends, they had wagon rides, they had small shops selling local honey and apple butter and pie, They had the smell of apples and cold air and something that a family in a minivan driving from Harrisburg could not get anywhere else. They had, in other words, figured out that they weren't in the apple business. They were in the memory business. Walter had driven home to Howell County with that idea burning behind his eyes. He had not mentioned any of this in the Farm Bureau gymnasium. Some knowledge is kept close until it's time. The years between 1985 and 1992 were not easy. Let me not romanticize this part, because that would be a disservice to the truth. Walter's 42-acre orchard required approximately $11,000 per year in operating costs during its establishment years. Labor, spray materials, trellis wire mowing, the thousand small investments that a developing orchard demands. His main farm operation, 760 acres of corn, soybeans, and hay, plus a 65-head commercial cow-calf operation, was generating enough to service his debt and keep the family going, but barely. The operating note at First Ozark Bank was restructured twice between 1985 and 1989. Roger Holt, who sat on the bank's board, was present for at least one of those restructuring meetings. Walter's son Dale later recalled that his father came home from that meeting quiet in a way that the family had learned to read, not defeated, but containing something. Pauline made coffee and sat with him at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for 20 minutes. Eventually, Walter said he smiled when they went over the numbers. Roger did, like he was watching something go the way he expected. Pauline put her hand over his and said nothing. The first partial harvest came in 1988, 3 years after planting. About 800 bushels from the most precocious trees sold to a produce wholesaler in Springfield at $5.20 a bushel. Walter cleared $1,840 after expenses. It was a symbolic number rather than a financial one, but the trees looked right, the fruit was clean. Dr. Aldrich drove down from Mountain Grove and spent a day in the orchard and said, quietly, that he hadn't seen better Jonagold fruit outside of Adams County in years. The real first harvest, the one that people later remembered as the beginning of everything, came in October of 1991. The summer of 1991 had been close to perfect for apples in the Missouri Ozarks. A mild spring with no late frost, a warm July and August with enough rain but not too much, a cool September that slowed the ripening just enough for the sugars to develop fully. Walter had walked his rows every morning from July onward, checking for fire blight, checking for codling moth damage, checking the color development on the Jonagold with the particular attention of a man who has been waiting 6 years for something and is not going to let it escape him now. By the first week of October, the harvest coming off that South Hill was extraordinary. The Jonagold ran large, most of them above 72 count, which means each apple weighed better than half a pound. The color was that distinctive bronze-red-gold combination that makes Jonagold one of the most beautiful apples in existence, and the flesh was cream-white and firm, and tasted like a controlled collision between a Jonathan and a Golden Delicious. The Gold Rush was slightly smaller, but the flavor was sharp and complex, and Dr. Aldrich, when he tasted one on the morning of October 4, 1991, stood in the row for a moment without speaking. "Walter," he said, "I have been growing and studying apples in this state for 30 years. He didn't finish the sentence. Walter understood. But the harvest was only half of what happened in October 1991. The other half was what Walter had been building toward since he walked out of that Pennsylvania orchard in 1984. Pauline had been the engine of it, if we're being accurate. Beginning in 1989, she had begun selling apple butter and cider and dried apple rings at the Howell County Farmers Market on Saturday mornings in West Plains. She was a precise, intelligent woman who had grown up in a family that ran a small dry goods store in Gainesville, and she understood retail in a way that Walter, who was primarily a producer, did not. She understood that people buy stories as much as they buy apples. She understood that a jar of apple butter with a hand-lettered label that said Greer Family Farm, Caulfield, Missouri, S. 1948 was worth more than the same apple butter in a plain jar. By 1990, she had a small word-of-mouth following in West Plains and had begun making inquiries with gift shops and bed-and-breakfasts along the Branson corridor. By October 1991, when the full harvest came in, she had 11 retail accounts in the Branson area. Now let me tell you about the weekend of October 12th and 13th, 1991, the first time Walter Greer opened his farm to the public. He had built, with Dale's reluctant help over a long August weekend, a rough but solid cider press shed using oak lumber he'd cut on his own property. He had rented a 30-year-old Goodnature basket press that had been used by a retired orchardist in Ozark County and could press 8 bushels an hour. He had hand-lettered a sign on a 4x8 sheet of plywood, Greer Orchard, you pick apples and fresh cider, and planted it at the junction of County Road J and Highway 95 on Friday afternoon. On Saturday morning, he and Pauline and Dale were at the farm by 6 a.m. Walter was in the cider shed. Pauline had set up a table with apple butter, dried apples, a hand-drawn farm map, and a coffee pot. Dale, who was 23 and had been working a welding job in West Plains, and who had driven out that morning with the slightly pained expression of a son doing a favor, was parked at the end of the driveway with a hand-lettered price list. The first car came at 8:15 a.m. By 10 o'clock, there were 47 cars on the property. People walked the orchard rows with the slightly dazed expression of people who have driven past farmland all their lives without ever actually standing inside it. Children ran between the trees. The smell of fresh-pressed cider drifted down the hill in the October air, that smell which is one of the most purely American smells in existence, somewhere between apple and yeast and cold air and autumn itself. By noon, Walter had sold $1,400 in cider, you-pick bags, and Pauline's preserves. By the end of the 2-day weekend, $3,100. He stood at the cider press Sunday evening after the last car had left, with his boots wet from dew and his hands stained brown from apple juice that no amount of washing would fully remove until February, and he did not say anything for a long time. Dale, loading equipment into the barn, stopped and looked at his father. "Dad," he said, "I think this might actually work." Walter looked at him. "It already works," he said. "Word travels fast in a county of 20,000 people." By November of 1991, the story of Walter Greer's Apple Weekend was moving through Howell County the way stories move in small communities, changed slightly with each telling, but carrying the essential truth in its core. The numbers were right. The cars had been counted by people who drove past. The fact of it was undeniable. At the Farm Bureau meeting that winter, Roger Holt arrived late and sat near the back. Walter was not present. He was home with a head cold that Pauline had been monitoring with the focused attention she brought to anything she decided to monitor. But Roger's silence on the subject of Walter's orchard was noticed. He had been loudly skeptical for 6 years. Now he said nothing. The room noticed. One farmer, a man named Denny Prout from near Willow Springs, who would later plant his own small orchard using varieties he bought from Walter's surplus stock, said later that Roger Holt looked like a man who'd bet the other horse in a 2-horse race and was watching the finish. The banker who had restructured Walter's note twice, a man named Phil Carver, not Roger Holt, a quieter and fundamentally decent man, called Walter in January of 1992. "I want to come out and see the operation," Phil said, "when it's convenient." Walter said February worked fine. Phil Carver came out on a cold Thursday in February and walked the dormant orchard rows with Walter, looking at the 340 trees, 7 years old now, their bark beginning to develop that characteristic roughness of productive age, their branch structures shaped by 7 years of Walter's careful pruning into the open center form that let sunlight penetrate to every apple. "How many acres do you have left on that south slope?" Phil asked. "About 60 I haven't touched." Phil nodded. He looked at the trees. He looked at the numbers Walter had given him, the 1991 revenues, the operating cost breakdown, the projected growth from the Branson accounts. "I'll tell you something," Phil said. "We've done a lot of operating restructures in this county in the last 7 years. I haven't enjoyed any of them." He paused. "I'd like to help you plant the rest of that hillside." Walter looked out over the rows. "I know," he said, "but I think I'll use my own money this time." The decade between 1992 and 2002 was one of the most consequential in the history of American apple production, and Walter Greer rode its currents with the steadiness of a man who had been watching them build since 1981. The Branson tourism explosion, which Dr. Aldrich had predicted and which Walter had positioned himself to serve, materialized with a force that exceeded even optimistic projections. Branson went from roughly 1.5 million visitors per year in 1985 to more than 5 million per year by 1994. The gift shops and restaurants and lodges that served those visitors needed product. Local product, identifiably Ozark product, with a story behind it. Pauline's apple butter and dried apple rings found their way into 14 Branson area shops by 1993 and 31 by 1997. Walter expanded the orchard to its full 102 acres between 1993 and 1998, adding several new variety blocks including Enterprise, a disease-resistant variety released by Purdue University in 1993, and a heritage block of 12 old Ozark varieties, including Arkansas Black and Winesap and Limbertwig, that he sourced from the Mountain Grove Research Station and from old homestead orchards whose owners were aging out of farming and whose trees Walter was determined to preserve. The heritage block was Pauline's idea, specifically. She had been reading about the growing interest in heirloom produce among chefs and specialty food retailers, and she had suggested it to Walter in 1994 in the way she suggested things, as a question. What would happen if we grew some of the old varieties? What happened was that in 1998, a food writer from the Kansas City Star drove to Howell County after a tip from a chef at a Kansas City restaurant that had begun sourcing Arkansas Black apples from Greer Orchard. The article she wrote, running approximately 1,800 words on the front page of the Star's food section, was headlined, "In the Missouri Ozarks, an old-fashioned orchard finds a new audience." Walter kept the clipping in the same box as Dr. Aldrich's letters. The farm's financial profile, by 2000, was unrecognizable from what it had been in 1985. The orchard was generating gross revenues of approximately $280,000 per year. Upick farm stand wholesale to Branson accounts, and a small but growing mail-order business for Pauline's preserves. The row crop operation continued, though Walter had begun transitioning some of his flat ground toward cover crops and rotational grazing, extending the cow-calf herd. He had paid off the operating note at First Ozark Bank in 1997. He had bought an additional 80 acres of bottomland in 1999 at $1,100 per acre. Prices had recovered with the economy, paid for in cash. Dale, the son who had driven out with a pained expression to help with the first open weekend, had left his welding job in 1994 and come back to the farm. He managed the orchard operation. He had married a woman named Cheryl who turned out to have marketing instincts that made Pauline's already considerable instincts look modest, and it was Cheryl who, in 2001, built Greer Orchard its first website. Dr. James Aldrich retired from the Mountain Grove Station in 1996. Walter drove to the retirement party and sat in the back of the room at the University of Missouri Extension office and applauded with the other attendees. Afterward, in the parking lot, the two men stood by Walter's truck for half an hour talking about nothing in particular. About the weather, about the new Enterprise variety's susceptibility to bitter pit, about a creek on Walter's property where Jim had fished once in 1983, and had caught a 3-pound smallmouth bass that he still described as the best smallmouth he'd ever caught. Neither of them mentioned Roger Holt. Neither of them needed to. Roger's farming operation, for what it's worth, had not gone badly. He was a capable farmer in a bad time, and the bad time eventually passed, and he continued farming into the 2000s. He and Walter were not enemies. They were something more complicated, men from the same community who had taken different views of the same landscape and had been forced over time to reckon with what each had seen. They ran into each other at the West Plains Walmart in the spring of 2002. Walter was buying fertilizer spreader parts. Roger was buying, of all things, a bag of bone meal and a small book on home fruit tree care. They talked for a few minutes about the weather, about the price of inputs. Roger looked older. The easy certainty that had surrounded him in 1985 had settled into something quieter. As they parted, Roger said, and Dale, who was with his father, later confirmed this precisely, "That was a good idea, Walt, about the orchard. I was wrong about it." Walter nodded. "I had good help," he said. He meant Dr. Aldrich. He might also have meant Pauline. He might have meant Earl, who bought this land in 1948 and knew something about the patience that land rewards. He walked to his truck. "Let me close by telling you what I think this story is really about. It's not about apples. It's about what Walter Greer understood that Roger Holt did not. And it's not as simple as he was smart and Roger was dumb, because that's not what happened. Roger Holt was an intelligent, experienced farmer. He knew commodity markets. He knew how the agricultural economy of Howell County worked. He understood the supply chains and the margin structures and the equipment economics. He knew his world. What he didn't know, what he couldn't quite see from where he stood, was that his world was changing. That the forces reshaping American food culture in the 1980s and 1990s were not a fad or a fringe phenomenon, but a structural shift. That the consumer who would drive to a farm in October to pick apples and drink cider and buy a jar of apple butter was not a nostalgic oddity, but the leading edge of a market that would, over the next 30 years, reshape how a significant portion of American food moved from farm to table. Roger saw the world as it was in 1985. Walter, because of 4 years of letters and 6 drives to Mountain Grove and 1 long road trip to Pennsylvania, could see, imperfectly, partially, but genuinely, how it was going to be. That is not a mystical talent. It is not luck. It is what happens when a person who is willing to learn keeps learning past the point where most people stop. There's a word for what Walter had, and it's not bravery, though courage was required. It's not stubbornness, though persistence was essential. The word is faith, but not the blind kind. The kind of faith that is built on evidence, on study, on the patient accumulation of knowledge in the service of a vision that you hold privately, against opposition, until the world catches up. Walter Greer planted trees that would outlive him. He understood that farming at its best is not a transaction. It is not the exchange of inputs for outputs within a single season. At its best, farming is a commitment to something that extends beyond the farmer. A 100-year apple tree is a statement about time, about stewardship, about the belief that what you tend carefully now will give something back not just to you, but to whoever comes after. In 2015, 30 years after the first survey flags went into that South Hillside, Greer Orchard celebrated its anniversary with an open weekend. They pressed cider on the same Goodnature press, upgraded and rebuilt. They sold heritage apple varieties that had not been commercially available in the Missouri Ozark since the Great Depression. They had visitors from Kansas City, from Memphis, from Chicago, people who had read about them online and driven hours to stand in those rows. Walter, who was 83 years old and had given the day-to-day management to Dale and Cheryl, walked the orchard that Saturday morning alone before anyone else arrived. The trees were enormous now. The oldest Jonagolds had trunks 8 inches in diameter and canopies 20 feet across. The light came through them the way light comes through old trees, filtered and golden and unhurried. He stopped at one of the first trees he'd planted. He put his hand on the bark. There are moments, and this was one of them, when everything a person has been and done and risked and believed is present in a single gesture, in a hand on a tree. He stood there for a while. Then he went back down the hill to open the farm. The Missouri State Fruit Experiment Station in Mountain Grove has conducted agricultural research since 1899 and remains one of the longest-running fruit research institutions in the United States. The Branson, Missouri Tourism Corridor grew from fewer than 2 million visitors annually in the mid-1980s to approximately 8 million by the late 1990s. Jonagold, Goldrush, and Arkansas Black are real apple varieties with the characteristics described. The farm debt crisis of the 1980s resulted in the loss of hundreds of thousands of American family farms. The characters of Walter Greer, Roger Holt, Pauline Greer, Dale Greer, Dr. James Aldrich, and all specific dialogue are dramatized for storytelling purposes. Historical and agricultural context is real.